Thank you for your patience, everybody. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this part of the Historic Venue series. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I'm the Online Engagement Coordinator at Canada's History Society. And I will also be the host for tonight's webinar. As per usual, if you've been here before, you will know. Tonight, Adara Goldberg will be speaking about the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre's Enemy Aliens Project. But before we get to Adara, I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada's history first. Canada's History Society is a national charitable organization, and we're dedicated to making Canadian history popular for a general audience. We do this in a number of ways, including our flagship publications, Canada's History Magazine, formerly known as The Beaver, and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids. We're also responsible for selecting finalists for the Governor General's History Awards. Each year this happens, and each year in Ottawa we congregate and we celebrate history with a national forum and a gala event for the finalists. In 2014, the Enemy Aliens Project was shortlisted for the Governor General's History Award for Community Programming. This award aims to inspire small volunteer-led community organizations in the creation of innovative programming that commemorates unique aspects of our heritage. Each year, 2 projects are awarded $2,500 and a trip for 2 to Ottawa to receive their award at the Governor General's History Awards at Rideau Hall. The deadline for this award is August 1st. So if you're thinking about applying, look at that application and send it in. If you're interested in knowing more about these awards or any other components of Canada's history, I welcome you to visit us at canadashistory.ca. And as always, if you have any questions, I welcome you to email me. I am all ears in any way I can help you guys understand us better. So a little bit of housekeeping tonight to prevent any glitches or lagging over the next hour. I recommend closing down any larger programs that you're not using. So if Photoshop's open and you don't need it, close it down, or a lot of tabs, bookmark them, close down that browser. That would be great, and it will help you receive the best experience you can tonight. But if there are issues, don't worry too much about it. The recording of tonight's webinar will be available on our YouTube channel later this week. If you are on social media, go ahead and spread the word about our conversation tonight. You can share the link I've been sending you in emails. That's okay with me. You can share. We have Twitter and Facebook. And so if you would like to tweet at us or share something we've sent on Facebook, you're more than welcome to do so. And if you have any questions during the webinar, you are welcome to ask them at any time. And if I'm assuming majority of them will be directed to Adara, and she will answer them as she sees fit. And if you have any follow-up questions, definitely be sure to send them along as well. I will be sending out a survey today. I'll send the survey in an email, but I'll also provide the link to the survey in the chat window closer to the end of the webinar. So click on it, fill it out tonight right after we're done. I want to know how your experience was and what I can do to make future webinars better. So without further delay, Adara, I would welcome you to unmute your microphone, and you can give a brief introduction while I load up your PowerPoint.
Excellent. Can everybody hear me? Can someone affirm that in the chat room? Perfect. So thank you very much, Jessica, for the kind introduction. What I'd really like to do is reiterate what Jessica's already said. If at any point during the presentation you have a question, please type it in. I will stop whatever I'm doing. I really envision this more of a dialogue between us. And as a result, I'm not going to be showing you certain photos. In developing this webinar, I came across some things that were really less interesting than others. And what you'll see as we go through is some highlights from the exhibit itself, as well as the legacy pieces. So I have not included too many photos of public openings or presentations because I don't think there's as much you can walk away with from those. I'd much rather have you engaging with the actual artifacts, which made the testimonies and the exhibit come to life. So what I can do while Jessica's loading the PowerPoint is set the stage for you a little bit. In order to understand why we did the Enemy Aliens project, you need to understand a little bit about Holocaust survivors in Canada. And so from 1933 to 1955, some 35,000 Holocaust survivors and their dependents immigrated to Canada. Among these new Canadians were concentration camp survivors, refugees who in Shanghai, child survivors who experienced the Holocaust hiding in convents and under assumed identities, and thousands more with their own unique stories of survival. Once they arrived in Canada, they undertook the immigrant experience that many of us are familiar with. They strove to learn a new language, to adapt to foreign cultural norms, rebuild their families, go to school. This is something we often forget about is most Holocaust survivors had their educations when the war broke out, and develop professional identities. Many survivors did just this, and they also assumed prominent roles in Jewish communal life. They found their way into different professions and participated in various aspects of public life. But along the way, there were hurdles that they had to overcome and promises they had to keep. For many survivors, the promise was to never forget their families and pre-war homes, their traditions and faith, and the exorbitant losses sustained at the hands of Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Determined that the Holocaust and its lessons for humankind never be forgotten, survivors across Canada spearheaded committees and organizations where they could educate faiths, races, and ethnicities about the dangers and discrimination of anti-Semitism. Excellent. I'm glad we're there. Our center, the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre, was founded by survivors who wanted to leave a legacy of anti-racism education for the citizens of BC. As an organization, we strive to eradicate anti-Semitism, racism, and social injustice by promoting human rights and genocide awareness through education and remembrance of the Holocaust. I know that's a real mouthful right there, but I think it is important for you to understand where we're coming from with this. As an organization, we reach more than 25,000 teachers and students each year through exhibits, school programs, and outreach. Just this morning, I attended and helped lead a symposium on the Holocaust in West Vancouver, where we had 500 students in attendance, grade 11s and 12s, and they had the opportunity to hear from a historian and a Holocaust survivor and participate in a Q&A. So these are some of the things that we do around here. Most of our exhibits tackle subjects that are lesser known. So we'll explore issues of gender, rescue, identity, propaganda, and human behavior, and with the goal of shedding new light into our understanding of the Holocaust through various perspectives. And this takes us to the focus of today's presentation. When I mentioned that we had these 35,000 some odd survivors who came to Canada, there's a group that was often missing from this cohort, people who for many years were not counted, either by choice or implication, among this contingent that we think of when we talk about post-war survivors. So in 2012, in June, the VHEC launched its most ambitious exhibit to date. This is Enemy Aliens, the Internment of Jewish Refugees in Canada, 1940 to 1943. And this exhibit tells a little-known story that draws link between the history of the Holocaust and Canada and the Second World War. This is something that's really important for the center to make sure that we're making these links It's something that many of you who are teachers will know about. We follow projected learning outcomes, and we try to stick really closely with curriculum demands. And this is one way that we can reach our students. A bit of history about the event itself. In 1940, Canada received about 2,300 Jewish male civilian refugees from Nazism. Many were between the ages of 16 and 20, having fled from Nazi Germany and Austria and sought asylum in Britain. Um, After a brief tenure of peace, some of them came in 1933, others managed to get out in 1939. The men were deported to Canada in response to Winston Churchill's demand to color the lot. This prompted the arrest of all potential fifth columnists or suspicious spies. There was a system that ranked people according to sort of the potential threat level, and many Jewish men, in particular, ended up falling into that category. After a brief moment of internment in the United Kingdom, the men were deported to Canada. Another contingent of men were sent to Australia. Interestingly enough, Britain quickly admitted their mistake in arresting the refugees. They were not, in fact, threats to anyone. They were refugees of Nazism, fleeing Nazism. They were not going to be the ones helping the Nazis win the Second World War. But Canada was unwilling to budge. Anti-Semitic immigration policy and public sentiment convinced the government to ignore the message about the refugees' true status and to refuse to admit any Jewish refugees into the country. So these refugees were forced to face the injustice of internment with resilience, and they tried to make the most of their time behind barbed wire. In the meantime, Canada's Jewish community worked with refugee advocates who were non-Jewish in an effort to secure freedom for these camp boys. The refugees' experience of internment in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, where they were imprisoned alongside German, Austrian, and Italian nationals, including real Nazis, had never before been told through a comprehensive exhibit and teaching program. And these remarkable stories and the significance of these internees' contributions to Canada and the Canadian Jewish community have national resonance. Many of those who were deemed suspect later assumed influential positions, and several were awarded the Order of Canada. Another one, was named a Nobel laureate. So, here are some of the photos that I'd like to point out. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go through each and every artifact. I would rather you have the opportunity to be introduced to them here and hopefully follow up on your own with our website at another time. But just to show you in the front, on the left-hand side, we have Fred Kaufman on his first day of school in Vienna in 1930. What we found that came into our collection were a number of these types of school photos, which were very popular in Europe at the time. Fred Kaufman ended up going on to become a provincial judge for Quebec. So just to show you some of the places that people ended up. And a big question for us is how we got here. What drove the creation of the exhibit, and what is its legacy? The seed for the Enemy Aliens exhibit was planted really at the initiative of the sons and daughters of former interned refugees. They were quite mindful that a history that had been transmitted to them in fragments. Again, many of these men did not tell the story. There was a sense of sort of guilt for many of them that they had managed, despite everything, despite their internment, to escape Europe, whereas many of their family members and friends did not. These sons and daughters were really concerned that with the passing of their parents, these stories would become even more remote and further removed from us, and that eventually, with the passing of this entire cohort, we would no longer know about this important moment in Holocaust and Canadian history. And so members of the second generation encouraged the center to undertake the research and development of an exhibit that featured these precious photographs, documents, notebooks, and artworks that were for the most part hidden in closets and cupboards in family homes. In our early discussions, before the exhibit was even fully conceptualized, we knew we wanted to do something, we just weren't sure what it was going to look like. We began speaking with families of former internees, and many items were brought to our attention. A few of them are some of the ones that you're seeing in here. In the top left-hand corner, you can see a drawing by Jerry Waldstone. Their watercolors we'll see later. These artifacts, including scraps of toilet paper, artwork sketched onto those, um, would be discovered and rediscovered in the months that followed. The more we reached out to one family, the more another family came to our attention. And so it was really a bit of a trickle along. Just as every artifact presented in the exhibit, suggested things that we were unable, to conceptualize otherwise, every eyewitness perspective recorded for the project reminded viewers of the voices that, for the most part, were impossible to capture. The children of these former internees who encouraged the collection of artifacts were equally insistent that those surviving former internees be documented. Again, when testimony projects had taken place throughout Canada and internationally, there have been different definitions about what constituted a survivor. And oftentimes, the survivor status was relegated to those who were living directly under Nazism from 1939 to 1945, because we often think of the Second World War and we place the Holocaust in that category. In fact, there's a much broader definition of what constitutes a Holocaust survivor, and it's really anyone who lived under Nazism or under collaborator rule between 33 and 45, whose life was threatened as a result of these political ideologies. So many of these men had not been interviewed prior. To capture these testimonies of the men, nearly all in their late 80s, if not well into their 90s, they were amongst the youngest of the men who were interned, two VHEC contract staff. Tony Lynn Friedrich, who is a very talented video editor and interviewer, and Vera Rosenbluth, an interviewer for the project, and also the child of one of the survivors featured prominently in the exhibit, set out on a cross-country tour. Accepting this time-sensitive nature of the project provided challenges. They were bouncing back and forth. There were 16 men featured in the exhibit in the end. All but one was interviewed within the last 5 years from today. 5 have passed away since the testimonies were recorded. One thing that's an important reminder, if you have students, or yourself or museum professionals who are accessing testimonies on the website, which I'll speak to in a few moments, it's really necessary to remember that the voices that are not included in the exhibit are equally as important, if not more important perhaps, than the ones that are. As I mentioned, the men who were interviewed were well into their 80s and 90s when these interviews were taken. And we have to be mindful of those voices that could never have made it in. When we had survivors, and something you'll be able to see on the website, speak to us about the adventures of internment, about receiving sort of unique educations from some of the top professionals in their fields, we're speaking to the younger ones. We're not speaking to those who had to leave, wives and children, senior parents behind, who left professions behind. We're speaking to those who sort of could treat this in a lot of ways as an opportunity they were not choosing to participate in, but something that they can make the most of. And so one thing that we can see on the top of the slide is the internment uniform. And this was one of 44 artifacts that was either donated or given on long-term loan to the VHEC from refugees, their families, and Canadian institutions. And we felt it really important to include this particular image. For those of you who may have seen materials from the exhibit at another time, this was one of those pictures that kept coming up. And a number of students and visitors seemed to have problems with it. They assumed automatically, if you're wearing a prisoner uniform, you're a prisoner. And this is in fact a challenge that many of the men who you can see in the photo below faced. By putting on this uniform, which they had no choice but to wear, they were in a sense admitting their guilt. They were admitting that they were dangerous. They were admitting that they might be a spy. This is a real point of contention, but it's also something that was a great teaching point for us. One thing that we've been able to do with our exhibit is feature even more both testimonies as well as artifacts and photos that could not make their way into the exhibit. Anyone who's ever visited the Holocaust Center knows that we're quite a compact space, and so there were very difficult decisions made about which testimonies and artifacts we should include. Developing an exhibit of this scope, the VHEC, really had to undertake a thoughtful planning process, careful research, and source out external support. So the 18-month project featured 4 researchers who were tasked with sourcing materials across the country. A lead researcher and sort of text writer in Dr. Paula Draper. She is a Canadian historian whose dissertation was among the first to consider the internment of Jewish refugees in the Second World War. Canada, designers, translators, video editor, sound mixer, photographer, in addition to VHC staff curator, archivist, librarian, and education director. Our final budget, which included the development of the bilingual traveling exhibit, our teaching website, public programs, and school program, were funded by a number of sources. For those of you who are working at museum sites, some of this might be familiar to you. We received generous funding from the Community Historical Recognition Program of the Department of Citizenship, Immigration, and Multiculturalism, as well as a number of other VHC supporters. And a separate grant from the Canadian Heritage Information Network enabled the Centre to develop this companion website to expand the physical and temporal reach of the exhibit. This is something that has served as an important legacy and educational component of the project. And we hope that especially through webinars such as the one we're doing right now, it will introduce more of you to the subject and by extension, your students, your colleagues, your staff. In order to make the project matter, we had to do more than simply put up an exhibit. And between June 2012 and June 2013, we developed a roster of public programming and educational initiatives to enliven the exhibit. The primary objective of the project was to bring the story of these men to the fore and to explore their contribution to Canadians' understanding of the immigration and wartime measures that affected Jewish refugees, but also other minority groups, including Japanese Canadians and Italian Canadians, as well as German Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians during the Second World War. So we were quite mindful of this as we developed programming, and this was represented in the individuals who participated in the programs. That said, it provided us an opportunity to engage with new audiences and communities that we may not otherwise be in touch with, and to conduct outreach to other cultural groups that experience their own forms of internment and historical injustice, both during the Second World War and at other moments in time. The timeliness of the programming and the range of options for meaningful extension created inclusive areas for reflection and dialogue about this one little known story and the ongoing of the residents of the Holocaust in Canada as well as around the world. By providing these points for dialogue, we approach things through the arts, our teaching website, cross-cultural panel discussions, and behind-the-scenes curatorial tour. That relate back to our opening reception held in June 2012, we drew about 300 guests and received unprecedented local and national media. Among those who visited with us and who spoke at the event were Rabbi Irwin Shield. He is in the lower right-hand corner. He is actually he's a rabbi in Toronto, someone that I know personally from growing up there. Very kind man. He was interned in Dachau following Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938, and eventually made his way to Canada, received both a university education as well as a yeshiva. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have Dr. Paula Draper. And I must sort of give credit to her. She is someone who really broke the mold in this field. She conducted her research in the late 70s and early 80s, when this story of internment was virtually unknown. The only people speaking about it were sort of the refugees themselves, with her daughter. We have in the center the Oberlander family. Many people know of Cornelia Oberlander. She's an architect, and her husband was a professor at University of British Columbia. That's their youngest grandchild, looking at some of the family's materials in the exhibit. In the top left-hand corner, we have Nina Krieger, who was the curator and education director at the center during the project's development. She is now our executive And in the top right-hand corner, we have several of the surviving former internees who came to join us. In addition to this program, we drew a behind-the-scenes curatorial tour for BC Cultural Day. This was something that we offered on a Sunday program. We did a number of these throughout the duration of the exhibit's run. We partnered with the Italian Cultural Center and the Nikkei National Museum and Heritage Center to present Legacies of Internment. This was a cross-cultural conversation about different experiences of internment in Second World War Canada. And again, it was an opportunity to bring in a new audience and to also sort of affirm the importance of all of our experiences. In the end, it was experiences we were sharing as Canadians of various backgrounds, and it's important lessons, for visitors who otherwise may never know or have the opportunity to realize all the points of communication and similarity between different cultural communities. Um, Looking from the arts lens, we had a program, The Music of Internment. It was a concert that highlighted music composed by German and Austrian refugees during their internment in England. And to develop this, we partnered with the Chutzpah Festival. And we did a film screening of Wendy Oberlander's film, Nothing to Be Written Here, which was about her father's internment experience. And Wendy Oberlander, again, whose son is that little guy in the middle picture, was a real driving force behind the creation of the project. Our website, this is probably the greatest legacy that we can be left with because it's something that continues to change and develop. The center partnered with Professor Peter Satius, who works with the Center for Historical Consciousness at the University of British Columbia, and his team to develop companion curriculum materials for the bilingual teaching exhibit, which is featured on the Virtual Museum of Canada. On the websites, visitors can interact with this moment in Holocaust history and Canadian history through carefully contextualized testimonies of former internees, artifacts, and text. This allows us to keep going. So we have this, and you can see along the top all of the different sections. Everything that was included in the physical exhibit and more is available for viewing on the website. Talking about these lesson plans, embedded directly on the pages of the online exhibit are complete lesson plans with dossiers of images and text that relate to these various themes of pre-war life, loss of freedom, life in the camps, and release. And the lesson plans that are featured offer teacher strategies for engaging with primary sources in the exhibit using the historical thinking concepts. These help us to promote historical and critical thinking for students and are geared largely towards students in grades 6 to 12. The challenge for both the student schools and general audiences is to challenge ourselves, to think critically not only about Canada's wartime internment policy and the response of refugees to internment, but also contemplate stories that have yet to be told, that have yet to be documented, and that need to be presented to museum audiences. And hopefully there's some museum educators amongst those of you here today, or you can pass this message along to your colleagues and friends, that there's so many stories out there. We often think that we've told it all, that every time we think that something new comes to the fore. Thank you, Jessica, for linking us to the website. I'm just going to speak for a couple more minutes, and then I'd really like us to have an opportunity for some discussion. One thing that's really special about the website, I mentioned before that it is an interactive living history document. And guests to the site are able to contribute stories and materials that relate to their own or their family members' experiences of internment. The site continues to do just that. I would say about once a month since the exhibit, online exhibit launched, we receive an email from someone who was directed to our website and who calls us with a new story. And so we continue to add these stories. We continue to add the locations, these photos, these narratives. And in many of these cases, these are men, and families that have never spoken about these experiences before. So in undertaking this exhibit development, we're committed to continuing to bring these stories of the accidental immigrants into public consciousness. It's not enough to put up an exhibit and walk away. We need to make sure that these men, women, and families feel supported, and they feel that their story and their experiences sort of are affirmed, but also that students and adult visitors can continue learning. We want you to be able to go back to the website each time and find something new. And the last place that we're at is that 2 years after the exhibit launch, or more, nearly 3 years, the legacy of internment continues to enrich and extend the reach of the traveling exhibit. Although the exhibit was developed on the West Coast, all of the former sites of internment were actually located in the East. And many of the former internees make their homes in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa. And so what we've been trying to do as an organization is to promote the traveling aspect of the exhibit. And last year, the Sherbrooke Historical Society, which is located very close to the Sherbrooke internment site, presented the French version of the exhibit. What we're trying to work on now is promoting, again, other communities to bring the exhibit to their own sites. And we know that there are museums across the country and Canadian missions that are operating in Europe that are investigating options for displaying the exhibit in the coming year. If you or your organization is interested in helping to bring this exhibit to your community, please do speak with me. We'd love to help you out. One thing that's quite fascinating for us is that the exhibit doesn't necessarily travel with artifacts, but in other communities where there are survivors of internment, they've had the opportunity to sort of reach out to the local population and bring in artifacts from those communities. So really, in conclusion, we'd like to think that the Enemy Aliens exhibit and legacy projects have solidified the significance of the internment experience as an episode of historical injustice, and that it's provided a real opportunity for critical thinking and engagement with lessons about Canadian and sort of international history. We hope that this was not done in vain. The goal is that we want us to all continue learning and to have a better understanding of our collective and shared pasts. So on that end, what I would like to do is stop talking and give people an opportunity to ask some questions. So thank you so much for all of your attention. And I open it up to you.
Thank you very much, Adara. That was a great presentation. Excuse me. And I really liked how you were able to show us images of the artifacts and images of images that are part of the exhibit. That's definitely a treat for us from all over Canada and South Carolina. Thank you, Nancy, for coming out. I my I guess this piques my personal curiosity is where is the exhibit on display currently, as well as when there are survivors in the cities that the exhibit is being displayed. Do those artifacts that are donated for that time get documented and cataloged anywhere, or are they just kind of a one-off for the public and then they're taken back to the basement or the attic or the living room?
So at the moment, the exhibit is not currently on display anywhere. The last time it was on display was in Sherbrooke, and we're working right now, again, with other museums across the country, including the possibility of having something in the Maritimes. There's interest from Interior BC, from Toronto, to bring it there then. So that's something that we're constantly working on. We have a collections assistant who, curates, possibilities. In the case of the artifacts, so one thing that's a bit different about this exhibit was because originally we didn't go out knowing what we were looking for. We weren't sure what people had in their own possession. So a lot of things came to the VHEC initially as loans for the duration of the exhibit, and it was quite a long exhibit. Oftentimes we display things for, say, a 3-month period. This time we were able to have it up for a full year. And so many of those initial loans ended up becoming donations to the center. And so we've sort of constantly, everything is cataloged. So nothing ever just comes in sort of ad hoc. People can't walk in and leave something at our desk, although they often try. What we are open to, especially when you're dealing with other sort of museums, other reputable museums, is the possibility of loaning artifacts. So things that are in our possession that we have the possibility to do, we're open to discussing that with other organizations. At the same time, though, thinking of Sherbrooke, or if the exhibit was in Montreal or in Toronto, there's small communities. There aren't that many survivors left of internment, but those who are there do have additional items, and we know that or we believe they'd be quite open to loans. For those communities, many people don't want to leave things in Vancouver at the center simply because it's quite far away, from their families, and they want to keep something, in an archive where family members could go and visit with them. But one way, again, that we sort of worked with this is by including all the artifacts from the physical exhibit, physical traveling, in the online exhibit. And so that's one way of engaging individuals. So there is a question from Nancy. It says, you mentioned briefly the internment of other nationalities. Do you know if other projects are being developed to explore the experiences of others? Do you see your project being a model? And what process did you use to record and preserve the oral histories? Excellent. I think I'm going to work backwards, if that's okay, in answering this. Our process of recording and preserving oral histories. So we have a video testimony project at the VHCC that actually predates the organization by more than 15 years. And it was begun by Professor Robert Bell when he was working at the University of British Columbia. He is a professor emeriti of psychiatry, and he's a child survivor himself. And he began a documentation project in the late 70s to record the testimonies, both audio and visual, of survivors in the community. And there's been several iterations of this project. The latest iteration, which has been going on since I believe the mid-2000s, has been done in-house by the center, by professional videographer and trained interviewers. And so these are all things that are in our collection. And right now we're actually undergoing a really exciting project to digitize, preserve, catalog, and create educational resources that relate to the testimonies. So these testimonies are not sitting in the archive, sort of stale. They're really living, breathing documents that we're creating, as we did on the website, some thematic assemblies, so students and other members of the public can go onto the website and be able to hear from survivors themselves. That's something we're continuing to do, and it's a long-term process that we're hoping to really have some models to share within the next year. Do we see our project as being a model? I hope so. I think the national support that we received from the various agencies sort of set a level of what we could achieve. It made it possible for us to do a large exhibit, an extensive exhibit, to be able to travel across the country, both recording testimonies as well as collecting artifacts. And that's something that we would not have been able to do without that degree of support. And so as a result, we hope, and we're in contact and communication with other communities. We speak with the Nikkei Center, we deal with the Chinese Canadian organizations, with the Italian cultural groups, in talking about these experiences. And we like to think that we provided some type of a model, and support. And again, as the education director at the VHEC, I really am in frequent contact with these groups. And we will do everything that we can to make our resources available. It's the reason we're quite transparent about things. We're not going to hide the fact that this was an 18-month project. This is a significant strain on staffing, on resources. We're a very small group of staff ordinarily, and this was the largest project that we've ever undertaken. So we like to think that there's lessons that can be extracted from it. And do I know of other communities are doing projects to explore the experiences, their own experiences of internment? Well, the Nikkei Center in BC, which deals with the Japanese cultural organization, they have several projects that they run that deal with the experience of Japanese internment. So just for instance, there are things out there. I think it's a matter of looking within your own community. But we are the only ones who have dealt with this particular history. I hope that answers some of your question. If there's more to follow up, please let me know, and I'm always happy to discuss either here or afterwards. Tanya wants to know if the Canadian government ever formally apologized, such as they have to the Japanese Canadians. Hmm. That's an interesting question. Um, One significant difference that needs to be pointed out is the Japanese were Canadians. And this is something that's quite different for the case of, the refugees. So Jewish refugees sent to Canada were sent over by Britain. Churchill and his government really pushed the matter on Canada, left them with very few options about accepting these refugees, largely against their will. But they were not Canadians. They were identified as, prisoners of war, as enemies. So, despite the fact that they were Jewish, they were also German, they were Austrian, and that posed a number of problems. There have certainly been, in the last few years, especially with sort of this exhibit being launched, commentary made about these slights and that they shouldn't have happened. But in terms of a formal apology, we haven't seen that. Um, but again, there's been dialogue around this, and I think that's sometimes more important than anything else because an apology only goes so far unless people are willing to learn from it. To simply make a statement that you're sorry doesn't help all that much. Um, so perfect. Thank you for putting the Nikkei National Museum site up. Last year, though, in terms of talking about sort of dialogue and apologies, the center participated in a day of reconciliation and dialogue at Simon Fraser University. And some of the work that we do in the last couple of years, especially, has dealt with sort of the Indian residential school system and drawing connections and parallels between the experiences. Again, very, very different experiences, but the loss of childhood, cultural freedoms, language, traditions. Um, and so those are conversations that we're constantly in. And I think they need to be ongoing. They really can't ever stop. If we stop questioning things and we stop, encouraging ourselves to probe a little bit deeper, um, I think it's a real missed opportunity because again, we reached sort of a year's worth of students. I think we had about 3,000 students come through the center in our physical space. Um, it can't just end there. Those can't be the only students who learn about wartime internment. So we want these conversations to really sort of remain present in our minds.
Adara, speaking of teaching more students about internment and this exhibit, as the educational director at VHEC now, what are you working on? How are you disseminating this information? And what would you recommend to teachers to use from
Hmm.
the website, from this exhibit?
Excellent. So one thing that we're quite proud of around here is we stopped printing our teachers' guides, a few years back. We'll print them, on request, but we now put everything online. So every exhibit that we develop at the organization goes online on our website. It contains sort of for groups that are coming here, pre and post visit lessons. It contains images that are featured within the exhibit, extension activities, historical timelines, glossaries. So these are all things that are available free for download on our teaching resource page on the exhibit, on our website, I apologize. And so that's something that outlives sort of the physical exhibit in our space. I know I'm from Toronto and I have some good friends who work and live out there, and they've used sort of the online website, the virtual website, which contains all of the lessons. We don't have all of sort of the images necessarily in the lesson section, but they've used the website in conjunction with the teacher's guide to do really meaningful, sessions on internment with their classes. So that's something that we really strongly encourage. And if you do look at the website, you'll see that there are teacher's guides for, I believe, something along the lines of 18 different exhibits that we've developed in-house over the last 20 years. So those are ways that we continue to do this type of outreach through this exhibit.
That's incredible. Thank you. The fact that
Yeah,
there
thank
are
you.
17 past exhibits in this resource is an archive in itself. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these are all things that we work to, as part of this digitization project. These are things that also fall into it because we want to ensure that we have copies of these documents that are accessible for many years to come. We don't want them to fall off. They're too precious. And it doesn't matter if an exhibit's with us for 6 weeks or a year, we still, produce the same scope of teaching material. And so, following on teaching material, Nancy's asking if we consciously consider school curriculum guidelines when developing our teacher's guides. Absolutely. So, we have a teacher advisory committee that we work quite closely with. Amongst that advisory committee is Professor Satius, who is at University of British Columbia, and he is one of the spearheaders of the Historical Thinking Project, which provides sort of entry points for dealing with historical issues. It's quite thematic, it's quite concept based as opposed to subject specific. And so we work closely with him, with other members of our committee. We have representatives who work with us who work with the teachers, with the school boards. We have lead teachers who run programs in their districts. And we try to follow things quite closely because, again, our focus has to be first and foremost on the BC curriculum. And what we're finding is, in BC at this point, everything's being revised right now. The Holocaust tends to be looked at in a few different places. Grade 6 general studies, grade 11 social studies, and grade 12 history. But again, the subject of the Holocaust itself is not actually mandated. So what we do is quite creatively, find links and connections. So for instance, the Holocaust may not explicitly be in the Socials 11 curriculum, but Canada's role in the Second World War is. And so this was one way that the Enemy Aliens project really attracted quite a bit of interest, was because it was something that teachers needed to teach anyways. They needed to explore sort of what Canadians were doing, what were Canadians thinking, all the different perspectives of wartime Canada, and we provided a way for them to look at this. Um, so again, these things are always top of mind. We don't develop things simply for the sake of, a subject being of interest. I have a doctorate in Holocaust and genocide studies, and there's a lot of things that I find interesting. I have my research I find interesting. I'll see, a topic, I'll read a book, but it's bringing it back, for us when we develop something, to doing something that will support the needs of our teachers and students, and those are always shifting. So again, status quo, doesn't exist. We can't follow that. We need to always be challenging ourselves and reaching out to sort of our lead educators who will tell us, what's working for them and what their needs are. We also offer biennially, we have a Shafran Teachers Conference, and that the last one took place in just a month ago on February 20th, and we were exploring the use of sort of historical sources in teaching about the Holocaust and other genocides after the survivor population is no longer with us. And so again, even the subjects of the professional development offerings sort of follow both teachers' needs as well as the realities of what we're dealing with when teaching about the Holocaust. So I hope that answers some of your questions, Nancy. May I ask if anyone here has ever used any of the VHEC resources before? And if you have, how you learned about them? Oh, Cheryl's saying she hadn't heard about the center until the webinar came up. Well, I'm glad you now know about the center. Hopefully you'll be able to access some of the resources now. Can I ask what role you're working in, Cheryl? If you're a teacher, if you work with a museum, if you're just a general community member participating today? Tanya says, I have not. I saw the website via the Historical Thinking website. Excellent. That's a really great way of learning about things. That's also part of the reason why we're so open with everything that we do. We want people to, learn about us. We want people to use our resources. That's what they're there for. Alicia saying that she hasn't heard of the center, but it would be a great resource for our museum and she'd love to discuss more about the traveling exhibit. I would love to speak to you more about the traveling exhibit. What museum do you work with, Alicia? Where is Coaldale? Excellent. An important thing to know as well, for those of you who are museum professionals or who work with an organization that's interested in hosting traveling exhibits, there are federal grants available to support the transportation and rental fees of traveling exhibits developed within Canada. So that's just a really important resource to be aware of. And again, if anyone has questions about that, I'd be happy to connect you with the appropriate staff person who can help you make some of those things happen. Does anyone else have any other questions? I see Tanya's typing. If I only had one day, which aspect of the internment would you recommend I focus on? Huh, that's a really good question. Let me take a look at it so I can tell you. And it's a tough thing. What I would recommend actually is if you only have one day, depending on the grade level of the students you're working with, is to have them independently explore some of the exhibit. I think a really important point is Camp Boys and New Lives, because we often think when we talk about the Holocaust, especially, we have a certain sense of what a concentration camp is, and it's important to differentiate between a concentration camp and an internment camp. And by looking at the actual incidents of, lives lived within internment, it gives you insight into how people observe their faith, how people worked, how people studied. And I think it's quite, it's both inspiring, for students and members of the public, to think about these things, that these were not men who were wallowing. These were men who were making the most of a really difficult and unfortunate situation. And there are also testimonies that are assembled for each of the sections, and they're not that long. So the nice thing about this is they were done, quite carefully and with an eye to the fact that people can only watch and listen for so long. So this is why I'm so impressed that everyone, so many of us are still here right now. An hour is a long time, to engage in a program. So most of the thematic assemblies where students would be able to hear from multiple voices, from multiple survivors, they run on average about 4 minutes in length. So it's quite user friendly. And it could also be something that you assign, to students to view at home, to pick, one particular, thematic assembly, you'll learn more about it, to examine one of the photos, to examine a document about sort of the experience of, fleeing. Because we often forget about that in order to get to Canada, people had to go through somewhere else. They didn't come directly here from Nazi Europe. And so that's something that I would really advise spending a bit of time with the exhibit and finding what stands out most to you and what fits where you are within a curriculum. You'll find that the lesson plans, the nice thing, they were developed with the idea that you could start at the beginning and go through the entire document, but we're aware that most teachers do not have that type of time. So you can also pick and choose things that work, for your students or for your audience. And again, I'd be really happy to chat with anyone outside of this about how to use the resources, how to make the most out of them, especially with limited time. Oh, you're so welcome. It's a pleasure to talk about this.
Thank you, Adara. Thank you, everybody, for all the great questions, and Adara for all the great answers. I learned a lot about the center and internment in Canada tonight.
Oh, well, I'm glad. Thank you. And thank you everyone for taking the time to participate in today's presentation. This is my first time delivering a webinar, so I hope you didn't get too many ums and ahs as I was trying to think about how to approach things. So thank you. And again, please do contact me with any questions. I'm always here to answer and to try to help you guys out, both in your classrooms, your museums, or in